couple of years ago, you were seeing a lot of people asking, some really basic questions like what is Bitcoin, explain the blockchain, stuff that they weren't really getting from major news sources. Whereas I think now you're getting a lot more interesting. I get the concept behind it. How could this be applicable to my industry? Which is great from our point of view because you get to do some really interesting thought experiments, and it's not just where this could potentially be a disruptor. You're already seeing prototypes coming out around other parts of the world where certain sectors are looking at, looking at asset management or land registration, various non-monetary based applications of the technology. So we're kind of at that stage. You're seeing less of an interest purely buying and selling and using Bitcoin. I think it's purely because the people that are doing it have their own methods, various sites and exchanges, and the real world use of them is fairly limited from a local point of view. There's a couple of businesses that will accept it, but it's not going to be seen as the default way of paying for anything, which I think a number of jurisdictions, and we tried this early on, you get a lot of interest in a location pushing this as a kind of interesting payment method, and it hopefully brings a lot more interest to that jurisdiction with people looking to do some other things. I think that's what we managed to get. I think generally because of the pace that the industry has moved at, yes, there are businesses that are purely Bitcoin, vertical, and everything is paid and bought with it. But I think especially from a UK point of view, and because our banking system hooks up into the UK, being able to go in and out of fiat is still a friction point, purely because UK banks aren't pro Bitcoin, or at least they're anti-crypto in any way. And if you have a bank transfer, and you label it, reference Bitcoin payment, it's going to get flagged. So I think until the banks have guidelines that they can operate under from a risk or compliance point of view, that's always going to be an issue. But it's meant that we can focus more on prototyping ideas and looking at different use cases for this, as well as continuing with what's going on in the rest of the world. So you're seeing, the same kind of ideas of if you need a trustless exchange. So there are some places in the world that are looking at land registry because maybe the government isn't trusted to do this, or maybe it doesn't have the infrastructure to do it, or asset management. There's a really interesting company in the UK who've come over to talk to us before about called Everledger, who at the moment look at using a sidechain to record diamonds and the metadata around a diamond so it can be tracked, and they're looking at evolving that for other asset management. So I think you're starting to see people look at, could I use this technology for not having to trust a central body, which I think in our parts of the world is less important because we do have an inherent trust of our government because, for the most part, they might be slightly inept in some ways, but they're not corrupt, or not massively so. So I think what you're starting to see is, could something using a blockchain approach increase transparency and increase the ability for stakeholders in a system to be able to see what's happening without having to give them keys to the entire system. And so I think where government touches parts of industry that require trust, so something like a company registry, so like Company House in the UK or our regulator have their own business registry. If there was a way of being able to implement changes of businesses in an immutable database that you couldn't maintain, something didn't happen because it's in this format, then you don't necessarily need it to be decentralized because you already trust that, but you want the ability to query that database in a way that doesn't reveal a lot of information, but reveals the information that that entity wants you to have. And so I think the registry have started looking at maybe there are ways that a blockchain approach could be done for registries in general, because the work that they tend to do locally is fairly interesting from a heavily regulated but progressive approach, which 5-10 years ago you didn't see that locally. So I think just being open to these types of approaches and ideas is a massive change. We definitely see a lot of interest in smaller businesses just generally being open to other forms of payment purely because of the cost of accepting cards. You see a lot of them either, if they're small, family-run businesses or small businesses that are starting up in the last couple of years, they're really quite shocked at the just transaction costs and ongoing costs that being able to accept cards in general, just the price of them. But I think that's because you're seeing younger people starting businesses and they're just assuming that there is a better way of doing this. And so they will come and talk to us and say, what's the best way that I can implement this? There is always going to be a point if you're dealing with low value goods and you're wanting digital payments. At some point, you're going to have to get out to pounds if you're not dealing in pounds. And the problem comes back to if the UK banks aren't allowing the payment processors like BitPay to have native bank accounts, you're going to have charges at some point. If it's not charge, it's a charge of time. So with BitPay, there's a higher limit that you need to transact with before you can get out to pounds. So you still have that friction point for businesses, but the fact that you're starting to see a lot with, we won't accept Visa or MasterCard, but we'll accept PayPal or any other kind of generic digital payment. You're starting to see, there was an initial flurry of Apple Pay adoption because there's a large proportion of smartphones on the island or Apple. But I think you're seeing throughout Europe that Apple Pay's adoption was fairly high because everyone has an Apple device. If they have one, they're going to probably activate Apple Pay. The problem has been the continued use that really do you want a fairly expensive bit of kit to have to get out of your pocket for every time you do a payment. The card itself, your bank card, costs next to nothing, and you can always get a new one sent for free. So I think it's going to be quite interesting how payments in general are approached. So you're already seeing the whole attitude of push and pull payments, and people are looking at doing push payments rather than pull payments using traditional banking infrastructure, but just with a different approach. So I think even if it's not something like Bitcoin that is going to be mass adopted, the approach to general payments, whether they're small value or high value, people are starting to realise that the banking infrastructure and the card infrastructure was not designed for the internet. And I think that's more of a localised view. I think when you're looking at businesses that want to deal globally, there's a number of people that I know who've come to me purely because they work in other countries. They said, right, what's the easiest way of getting paid in Bitcoin? You set them up with a wallet. The person already wants to pay them in Bitcoin because they're in somewhere else that it's hard to transact over to pounds. And then that becomes a lot easier. So I think as soon as the friction point of being able to get in and out of fiat in more countries becomes less frictionless, it's going to be a lot easier. And you're probably going to see adoption rise. I think also just generally the price stability has been quite surprising for a lot of people in the last couple of weeks. A lot of people assumed that it was going to go a bit crazy because of the Brexit, and a lot of other currencies were fluctuating too much, but it didn't really change overly. And also, because of that, you're starting to see less people go, I want to get involved in this because I've seen it go up like 1,000% in 6 months or whatever. So people understand it's less of a get-rich-quick scheme. It's more, understanding the process and how it could be built on. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the crypto sector at the moment regarding how do you scale this. You've seen things with the DAO and ETH like having to hard fork because of that, and it's still seen as a kind of experiment, which I think isn't a bad thing. It just means that it's going to take a while for your average person in the street to see this as the norm. But that's down to adoption and UX. You're already seeing companies like Circle, state that okay, we want to be the PayPal for Bitcoin, but they now allow you to hold dollars. So, their system will use Bitcoin, and internally it uses dollars. So, you're seeing that merging the two. At some point, if PayPal adopts it, it's just going to be seen as another currency. I think if the scaling's sorted out, then people are going to use it more, but not realise they're using it, which is one of those kind of great thoughts that people have had over the last couple of years. If you're using Bitcoin, you don't know it while you're using Bitcoin. Well, it doesn't matter. It's a better way of doing things. So a number of years ago, the people that I work with really started lobbying quite hard for. There's been a big movement for looking at diversifying away from purely a finance industry and embracing the digital industry in a wider range. And a lot of the initial thought around that is, an emerging sector that's looking for a home that could be potential because of the FinTech tie-in would be crypto. And that started the ball rolling, and we've now got to the point that there's significant research done in what Jersey could do to adapt its current regulation to allow businesses to be here in working in that space. And the thought pattern that they've followed is very similar to the initial European one, which is they are purely concerned with where virtual currencies go in and out of fiat currencies. So personally, I think that's a really good stance because it means that you're not going after every single sector that's wanting to use cryptocurrencies or virtual currencies, or even blockchain with non-monetary approaches, but you do allow then the larger sectors of, say, exchanges or ATMs or funds, or things that are already out there, but probably are dealing with various parts of regulation from various agencies in separate countries, or they're having to look at something like the BIT license in New York, which is, as most people understand, fairly comprehensive would be a nice term, but like massively overbearing would be another. And so this approach to really a light touch regulation of it was put forward, and it's gone through the State of Jersey, the government's approval process, and it's probably by September going to be in law. So what it essentially means is that there's been a change to the law on a money service bureau company, which essentially is something that trades in things that are worth value, but potentially could be currency, but doesn't have to be. To include the phrase virtual currency and then a term around that. So essentially, if you're an exchange, you would register as a money service bureau as a virtual currency business, and you'd follow the regulation that currently applies to normal MSBs. The interesting thing is that they've decided to put a sandbox to encourage startups. So essentially, to be regulated, you'd have to apply for a license, and there would be a fee attached. But they're putting in place, under this guidance, if your business is doing under £100,000 per annum, that you have to notify them that you are a virtual currency exchange, but you wouldn't be subject to the fee for the registration, and also you wouldn't be subject to proactive auditing by the regulator. So essentially what it is trying to do is to encourage startups to be based here and allow them to grow their business. And when they get to a certain part, they know the road to being regulated, and they should have already applied for the standard approaches for KYC and AML compliance. So it should be a lot more cost effective for a startup, to prove a business model, because the main feedback was if you just apply this to existing businesses, you might get one of the two big exchanges move over here, but you're not going to be encouraging any new companies starting up, and you're not encouraging an infrastructure to grow here. You're just encouraging one or two to move here. So that's been really interesting, and also the approach from the research that the industry body Digital Jersey has done with the government for the opportunities in well, they term virtual currency, but it's pretty much read as cryptocurrencies. Has been quite interesting, just because they haven't purely limited it to if you want to deal with monetary-based systems. So although it's termed virtual currency for that part of you, they're holding up a flag and saying, if you're wanting to do something, say around blockchain, business registries, or asset management, or something along those lines, that we at least have an idea of what you're trying to do, come and talk to us. I think that's a massive move. You wouldn't have seen that 5 years ago. So that's really good. I think the other thing has been that they've been doing a lot of research on what areas Jersey could be developing propositions for. And one of the working groups is a blockchain one. So they're not narrowing it down to purely Bitcoin or virtual currencies, but the whole approach for a government to put together a working group to develop propositions, and out of the four, one of them's a blockchain one, is a fairly big message, I think, especially when you're looking at what else is going on in the digital sector and what could be happening purely in FinTech or regtech or whatever other tech is the kind of what everyone's shouting about this day. If they see a real long-term benefit for pushing forwards blockchain-based companies or blockchain research in general, I think that's fantastic for a government to be doing. Yeah, I mean, you're seeing definitely a bigger push for A, understanding what the rest of the world is doing around fintech, and B, the government can never encourage the companies that are based here to do R&D and further their knowledge. That's not the government's role. But I think it's their job to realise if there needs to be education around a space or an area, or there's an opportunity for encouraging more businesses to be here, then that is their remit. So I think that's what we've seen, a number of fintech events with a lot of companies coming from off island to them, and nearly every one of them will have a number of speakers from blockchain companies, or there'll be even at traditional finance events there'll be someone mentioning blockchain, because no one wants to say Bitcoin, but they'll say blockchain anyway, in those places. And it's almost, if you go to one of these events and someone isn't talking about it in some way, shape or form, even if it's in a bad light, something's missing. So it's definitely part of the narrative now, which I think is really, really good. And there's been some great pushes by government to encourage that. I think the next step will be, after obviously putting in regulatory guidance so companies know where they can sit if they come be based here, will be lobbying banks, because that's still the big question mark in the UK. You're seeing a number of higher profile Bitcoin and blockchain companies get bank accounts, but it's still very, very hard for startups to do so unless there's a connection somewhere. And because Jersey issues its own banking license, completely separate from the UK or Europe ones, I think there is definitely a gap for a challenger bank to look at, maybe basing themselves here as a pilot. Or, the general point is always, well, out of an island with 100,000 people, is the market big enough to move a bank here purely looking at small, medium businesses. But if you're the bank that's known as the one that will, talk to blockchain companies, and a lot of them happen to be moved here because of this regulation, then surely that's a sign that either you're doing the right thing or the more traditional banks here will sit up and listen. So I think that will be the next step, but hopefully we can move faster than the UK can, purely because we do have that the fact that we issue our own banking licenses, and we can take each application as it comes. There used to be a guidance that you'd have to be in the top 500 banks in the world to be able to get a banking license locally, with a couple of other guidance around that, but that's now a lot more relaxed. And it's not saying that still isn't the place, but they will welcome any inquiry. So I think it's partly the government maybe has to hold up a banking license and say who wants to come here, but also you're seeing the larger banks, all of them now have blockchain R&D groups, or they're hiring consultants to do so. So I think it's only a matter of time before someone says, actually, maybe we should be looking at allowing our offshore variants to be banking these as well. If you're going to do that anywhere in the world, maybe doing it in a place that's well renowned for regulation would be a good shout. I think just on the fact of there's a number of companies locally who are looking at building things using either the blockchain or Ethereum or a sidechain variant as part of a system that previously wouldn't have had it. And I think that's quite interesting, because you're traditionally in smaller jurisdictions, you'd see safer approaches to developing software and systems. And I think the fact that people are looking at the emerging trends locally and saying, well, actually, there's no reason why we can't be at least prototyping these systems locally, is a really good sign. And it shows that the noise that's coming out of Jersey, both internally and in the government and from the press, is being heard, because people are going, oh yeah, I'll try this. Whereas I think traditionally there's always been a state of where someone else in the world is doing this thing, but we'll stick to what we're doing because we know how to do it. And that's starting to change, and I think that's only going to be a good thing.
Perfect.
Cool.
Robbie, appreciate it.
Cheers, buddy.